Constituents, which is a little play on my Coffee with the Constituents, which I do during the legislative session on Friday mornings. Every week, folks are welcome to come down to the State House. Typically, we have about an hour and a half when my door is open, and sometimes there's tourists walking by going, "What's up?" And they come in, and some folks are regulars who come every few weeks, and others make a trip down once a session, and you're always welcome to come down and chat with me about whatever's on your mind, present whatever issue, concern, thing that's going great in your community that I should know about, concerns in your communities or in your own lives, questions you might have about how the State House works or how you could have a voice in the system beyond your amazing local representative, or how you can use Dan better or others, your senator as well. And or if there's a particular issue that you haven't had a chance to learn as much about and you want to know more about it, if I either know the answer or if I don't, we try to find out and I'll put you in touch with who knows more. So now in the non-legislature part of the year, just heading around a bit. I really want to thank you all for coming out. This is a nice turnout. Sometimes Coffee with Constituents has 3 people, sometimes it has 15, so this is a really robust turnout, so thank you.
It's great.
And it's a free-for-all. Sometimes someone might ask me a question and someone else in the room might actually be fairly knowledgeable on it, more so than I am. And so I can learn from the dialogue that happens as well. So we're gonna, Cal helped organize it, so.
No, just want to make sure we thank the Masons and Order of the Eastern Star for letting us use.
Absolutely. And the great chefs, and who pressed the cider?
I do this with the Laramie kids, well, especially this year.
Well, it's today, so stuff. Yeah, absolutely. So really, whatever's on your mind, or how your summer's going, or what's going on in Washington, which I can't really speak for as much, nor do I want to give any excuse to it, that's for sure. But if you've got questions or comments about what's happening around the state, I know for me, in the summer I'm farming a bit more, and most people don't really want too many evening events, which now it's starting to get darker at this time of night. But frankly, in the middle of the summer, there's not a lot of political meetings and gatherings because you're all tired of us doing our work during the session. Everybody needs a break, and we all want to enjoy the incredible thing that Vermont is in the summer with evenings till 9:30 and so forth, and not be in these kinds of meetings. So now it's fall, we're turning back into it. And Dan,
and we're definitely thinking about the upcoming legislative session. Over the summer I worked with the Older Vermonters Working Group, and we brought together a lot of folks around the issues that affect older Vermonters and how we can make sure services are coordinated, and what are we measuring and how are we measuring it, and those are just finishing up, so we're starting. Teresa Wood from Waterbury, Representative Wood from Waterbury, and I are writing an Older Vermonters Act, which basically works around senior centers and Meals on Wheels and companionship and transportation, and how, as Vermont is an aging state, how are we going to be able to try to provide these services and make sure that people who are working in these services are adequately paid, where they are not now. So, that's what I've been doing over the last few weeks, is wrapping up this working group that met all summer. It was pretty neat to have all of the different agencies that provide services sitting around one table and really trying to come up with, how we can do a better job at coordinating between the state and the nonprofits that are working out there. And actually the report will be finalized this Friday, but there's a draft online. I'd be glad to show anybody who wants to read this. I think it's like 60 pages, but.
And I've also wondered, I'm hearing about different school challenges as we have declining enrollments. Can we turn our schools into school/community centers and get more seniors in our schools and use that same space after school as a community center for seniors and have more interaction of intergenerational activity as well?
Yeah.
There's a lot of possibilities of things that can happen in this state. And it's community by community based on interest, obviously. But anyway, I'll have to ask you more about that.
Yeah, no. Yeah, absolutely.
But does anybody have something that's on your mind, what's going on that you want to talk about, ask either one of us, bring up? Sure.
Yeah, I've been working with the planning commission for a lot of years, and through time, we have seen a lot of really great initiatives from the state. Energy was the last chunk that we had, you know, those goals to be renewable, great. But what we're finding as a municipality is that these goals and these laws, in some cases lately it's the one on erosion and taking care of our roads, the municipalities are footing the bill and trying to figure out, okay, so it's coming down from the state, but there's no help, no support that we're feeling to be able to create and follow and, you know, be able to achieve those goals.
Well, one of the things that I have experienced in basically all of my adult life ever since Reaganomics started, which was 1980 when I was 9 years old, is this idea that we could just keep cutting government, cutting tax rates on wealthy, and somehow still say we need to do all these things as government, whether it's local government or not. It used to be that a lot of money, because individual communities vary in economic strength so greatly, and then the state as a whole can try to, you know, moderate that some, and then at the federal level it can do it even more. And what we've seen was first austerity at the federal level, unless it's tax breaks for the wealthy and running up the debt, and then at the state level, the same thing, which is this perpetuating of a myth that wealthy people, if they keep all that money, will always reinvest it in their communities. And some is. I want to thank some folks who do invest a lot in their communities, but so much of it goes to Wall Street. We've seen this distribution of wealth curve just explode in opposite polarities over the last 40 years. And the reason I say all that is it's directly connected. We can have all the goals we want, and we can pass all the noble laws with visions that we want, but if we don't put resources into it to make it happen. And one of the things that happened this year in the legislature, the House had passed a bill. I don't know which way you voted, and it's not important to me at the moment. I'm trying to throw you under the bus or raise you up one way or the other.
I'll tell you how to vote.
But,
Which bill is it?
well, to put 2 cents on fuel tax for weatherization, right? And it had moved over to the Senate, and I was asked on public radio, do you support the 2 cent tax for weatherization? And I said to Bob Kinsmore, I said, well, before I answer that, because they all want simple answers that you can quickly use as a, you know, slay you or raise you up. I said, our state goal for weatherization, our vision, our goal, was 65,000 homes to be weatherized by 2020. We are in 2019, and we've weatherized about 25,000 homes. Now, this bill was going to add, I think we do a handful of 100 a year, and this is going to add another 300 or 400 a year. And I said, if you do the math with a year and a half left, and you add 300 more on top of the 800 that we're going to have, we're not going to get from 25,000 to 60,000 weatherized homes. And I'm just very frustrated by these noble goals that make the general public feel like we're doing something, and we have these aspirations that we then don't fund. And I said, what I would do, rather than saying yes or no to 2 cents on the fuel tax, frankly, is if wealthy Vermonters, or all Vermonters, in aggregate, got a, quote, $500 million tax break per year from the Trump tax cuts. 300 of that 500 million is in the top 10% of Vermont earners, or wealth folks. I said, what if we said, okay, let's for 5 years, we'll set a timeline, for 5 years, say, how about half of that? Let's take $150 million, instead of it going to Wall Street through those people's pockets, put it into Vermont through a tax, and put 30 million a year into weatherization, not an additional 4 million, for 5 years in a row. Let's put 30 million a year into truly building out rural broadband so that people don't drive as much. This is about the climate and the environment. So if we put 30 million a year for 5 years in a row, that local communities could also pool resources to match or find grants and really invest in broadband. Not only could people commute far less for work, but also, you want to talk about attracting, quote, young people to the state. If you have high-quality internet in the state, and young entrepreneurs want to start software businesses with clients in Boston, Connecticut, and New York, they could run a business out of Vermont and visit those clients once a month for 3 days and live in Vermont and repopulate our rural communities. And on and on. So it's a long sideways answer to your point, but the point is, if we set goals and we don't have funding for it, it's really not fair.
But I think those back roads to curb erosion was something that was passed in the legislature to try to deal with Lake Champlain and the feds and not have us come into out of compliance on something that would cost more, which is a lot of our wastewater treatment facilities. So I think you're seeing Jim Ryan, who runs the program, he lives in Woolkhead. I talk to him all the time, trying to figure out like what changes can we make to help towns, you know, deal with erosion and to stop the runoff into, you know, where did this bill dump the responsibility on the towns, and how can we, you know, still try to help, you know, curb erosion and maybe look at stream bank restoration and buffer strips. You know, how do we do that instead of saying, you know, you have to stone line your ditches and, you know, up on a class 4 road or whatever, and, you know, gets really into some serious money. And honestly,
there is some money that I think over the next couple of years will start to be more apparent, because they did sign the bill to put $50 million into clean water. Now, there's a little bit of robbing Peter to pay Paul. It wasn't really new money, so other programs are going to get shorted for that. But there is a lot of money that's moving into the clean water direction. I'm fairly certain some of it's going to go into the
And then on the weatherization, we did make some pretty serious investment. Matt, who couldn't be here tonight, his committee, Commerce and Economic Development and Workforce Training around weatherization. So right now, our workforce is getting built up around that. So, you know, through tech centers, and they did some investments there so that when money, you know, if we were to enact that 2 cent, that money could be made sure it could be spent, because we'll have a workforce to do that kind of work. So
It seems like, you know, obviously our state is always strapped for money. When are they going to get their act together with regards to, you know, as far as legalization of marijuana being sold through stores? I mean, I know my wife's involved with the union for college back. She's been in a lot of times, and she's been in meetings where, you know, that money is already being talked about being divvied up. When are they going to get their act together? After New York and New Hampshire legalize and all the out-of-staters can't bring in their money?
If you can answer for the House, I'd love, I've been working on this for 25 years, so I'm asking the same question.
I can't believe it didn't come out of Ways and Means. I mean, I know I sit across the hallway in Human Services from Government Operations, and they were up there late night trying to negotiate that thing out, and I was bummed it didn't come to the floor. You know, it didn't. I think it got stuck in the Ways and Means Committee on how the taxes would be assessed, and you know, I think a big concern is how do we protect small businesses and make sure that, you know, small farms and small businesses are going to benefit from this. But I would be interested in your perspective on it. I thought for sure it would come out right at the end, and it just didn't. We just went home.
I was pretty sure it was not going to come out because, frankly, the top leadership in the House is not very warm to this topic. And on top of that, the governor is difficult. And I get in trouble sometimes for talking, you know, ill about my friends. But the reality is, leadership in the House has been about as difficult as the governor has been on this topic. And I think the general sentiment of the population is where you are. I've heard it all across the state. My last campaign, this topic was one of the topics that was trying to be used, not really against me. I think it was a very fair campaign across the board in the race I was in, but it was, you know, David is the pot guy. And I went from a 6-point win to an 18-point win. And so I kept saying, you know, there were other topics too, like minimum wage and others. And I kept saying to all my friends and colleagues in politics, I say, look, if these were the things that were being used to be the issues, which is very reasonable to do, to try to differentiate one candidate from another, and the candidate that's in these positions on these issues wins wholeheartedly, then move forward on the topic. But I don't know what the reason is that the speaker has. I know that there are some Democrats and senators who Democrats or Republicans who oppose the legislation, but have the vote, let people vote how they want, as opposed to sort of pressuring in one way or another. And I think it'll come up this coming year, because I think the pressure has continued to build. The stores in Massachusetts, I have friends who have gone down, or acquaintances even, who have said, Dave, I was just down in Massachusetts and I was in Northampton, so I thought I'd go see what it's like. And it's this really professional store, and there's license plates from every single state in the union, but particularly New England states in this store. Lines out the door, the law enforcement 100 yards away is directing traffic. And it's absurd what we're leaving on the table.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Has anyone given a presentation at the State House regarding the medicinal uses of cannabis?
Well, we have a medicinal use law. So,
how growing your own, you can avoid going to a dispensary, right? You never know what you're getting from a dispensary. You hope it's good, but Vermont, our brand is organic and green and everything. I just wondered if that had been, would that be a good argument to help? The fact that it's not being passed is probably due to ignorance on a lot of the voting people.
So I was just at the conference up at Burke on Kent just this couple days ago, and one of the things I talked about is the fact that we've had 80 years of propaganda around this plant that has been factually completely inaccurate at best, and incredibly racist, frankly, at worst. And when I started being an active person around this topic back in the 90s, it was about the racial disparities, the injustice of this substance. I think around the State House, many of these conversations are happening. There are enough people knowledgeable, both in terms of lobbyists, legislators. I don't know what the number of Vermont legislators consume, but in their lifetime, I bet in Vermont it's a higher percentage than in, say, Alabama, that are in the legislature. So it's not a foreign topic, but people still feel nervous to change it. Politicians are inherently nervous to go forward until you feel like your constituency is fully there. And so I encourage people to contact their legislator. And the other reason is that I said is when you contact your legislator, and you've got a good one here, but if Dan can go to the Ways and Means people and say, I'm getting a lot of calls from my constituents who want us to pass this, that puts pressure on his colleagues who are friends and allies on the committee to do it. And when it's particularly within the one party that's now determining that, the more they hear from their colleagues that it's important. Dan, you're just saying, I thought they were going to do it. I thought they were going to do it. Well, if you call him and say, what's the status? He has to go to a representative and say, what's the status? I've got a constituent asking me. That puts pressure on his colleagues.
Luckily, I sit next to Sam Young, who's from Greensboro or
Yeah.
Glover, and who's on that committee, so I can just turn right over, ask him. But anyways,
We can always primary.
yeah.
And you can also talk to leadership.
I guess I'm talking about education, just basic education. It's 2.5 years ago, I had no interest in knowing anything about cannabis. I'd given it up in the 70s. But then I found out that about its anti-cancer properties, and to make a long story short, I had a dog with cancer, and she lived 2.5 years by giving her my homemade cannabis. And that made me want to know more about it, so I've been doing research. And now I'm one of you know what I mean? It's like, we're crying out loud, we can grow this, and it helps so many different illnesses. And yeah, you can get high too, and that's nice, it gives you a sense of well-being. I'm all for that in this crazy world, but the serious medicinal uses. And if you could get a doctor or somebody with credibility, I have no...
We have some doctors who are supportive, we have some doctors who are opposed. The legislator who's a doctor happens to be vehemently opposed.
Who is that?
George Tillman.
He's consistently opposed to smoking.
Smoking in general. Forgetting the fact that now it's edible, it's tinctures, it's rubs, there's all kinds of other ways to consume it. But what I would say, if you're willing, because this is where, as someone who's been very outspoken for decades on this, is letters to the editor or op-eds in Vermont Digger or other things that are educational and thoughtful and reasoned and presented. those over time start to change that conversation. So for those that are passionate about whether it's this topic or another topic, along with voicing it directly to your legislators or to me, you have ways to reach a much bigger audience through that public place called news and
Yeah,
content.
taking the focus away from just it being a recreational drug, because it's so much more than that.
In your research, you even sent things to labs to have them analyzed to make
Right.
sure that you have the
Stuff
qualities.
that I grew, yeah, you can have it analyzed.
And now there's more labs than there used to be. Yeah.
The other side of this that I think it goes toward the education piece is there's still a lot of people out there that believe the gateway drug myth.
Yeah.
And the
It's a
idea
gateway
that
to happiness.
if you're gonna smoke or use marijuana in some way, you're then gonna at some point in your life want to do heroin. And it's a real, I think it's a concern.
It's ignorance, basically,
Well,
you know.
And on that one of the responses I have about that is I literally say, I have known many, many people that consume cannabis, including myself, and not once did I ever think, this is fun, I think I'll stick a needle in my arm.
Honest to God.
Right, so if you take what they're saying and you make it very direct in that way, then it shows how absurd that is. Especially as we now know, like the Sattler family and others are crooks, right? It's the pharmaceutical industry. So, and drug pushers, right?
Yeah.
And so, but I think the gateway is still discussed, and some of the folks in the legislature still believe it, and you know, we continue to work to dispel it.
So again, education is the key.
Well, it seems to me that we talked about weatherization and we talked about cannabis. And being a new, but so far, but being a new Vermonter and having done a little stint at the State House and watched and listened, what I keep hearing in this room and I keep hearing in that building, and I hear all of my neighbors in Montgomery talking about weatherization, efficiency Vermont. I have so many neighbors in Montgomery. We got our house insulated by Efficiency Vermont. I have at least 12 neighbors that I know of that have never heard of the program because they think it is welfare. They don't get it. And it's the same thing with cannabis stuff, because I also, some of those same neighbors give me that old school idea of gateway drugs. So it seems to me that what the State House could do that might help mitigate this is create a more sense of public awareness and an educational forum through media, through advertising, and I know there's some stuff, but it doesn't seem to me like it's a broad enough thing. And it doesn't seem like it's something that reaches everyone.
Right.
So that's...
Well, the state has a lot of different programs that it reaches out through the avenues and directions that it has, whether it's through the health department, through schools, through others. They're back to limited resources. There's some limits there. I will take this moment to do my shameless plug for my newsletter, because we try to put out information to folks all across the state. So who here doesn't or does get, who gets my newsletter? Anybody here get my newsletter? So if you don't get it, you're welcome to sign up on this handy little clipboard. And we tend to pass around, we tend to send out every few weeks during the legislature updates on topics, programs, organizations, the tie between the nonprofit organization doing work and the state doing work, so that you can have some more information. That's not going to reach 600,000 people. And it's, unfortunately, advertising is particularly expensive, whether it's mailing or TV. And, you know, part of the world of advertising is through the governor, through me, through your own reps, talk about these issues and how we talk about them. And, you know, I don't think this governor or myself or Dan talk about welfare in a disparaging way. There are, and none of these are welfare, but there is the meme out there, particularly with this president, that welfare is a horrible thing, that state money supporting X, Y, or Z is a horrible thing. You go, well, then let's get rid of truly everything. Let's get rid of the roads, let's get rid of our schools, let's get rid of our socialized, you know, fire squads and police stations, and let's get rid of this grand social democracy experiment that actually has made the backbone of our economy ever since, you know, building the highways and extending rural electrification. But welfare has become a demonized term, which then makes people think any government money is bad, instead of we all contribute and we all use it when we need it.
And that's what we're contributing our money to. It's sort of like putting it in the bank for when you need it again, or if you need it again.
And weatherization, I think, trying to reduce our carbon is important. And, I just went to a meeting down in Waterbury on a cap and invest on transportation fuels. That is an 11-state initiative. And it will be interesting to see how that rolls out. They've only had one meeting so far, so I had a lot of questions for Tim Briglin, who's the Energy and Technology Chair, after that meeting. And we've been corresponding, but there's still a lot that needs to come out about how we can reduce our transportation fuel usage, because that really is, in Vermont, one of our biggest carbon uses. So we'll have to see if we can invest in fixed route transportation in rural communities. It's really hard to do, but I think we'll have to figure it out.
Switzerland.
Sorry, Joe.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Before we get too far away from it, I just wanted to say something else about the cannabis issue. I was at a family gathering with my Massachusetts relatives, and marijuana came up as a topic, and they said, "Uncle Pete, what's the story of Vermont? What's going on?" I said, "Well, you can smoke it in the privacy of your own home. You can use it, but you can't buy it and you can't sell it." And they all kind of looked at me crazy, like, "Well, how do you get it?" And I said, "Well, I hate to inform you, but there's been an underground market for a really long time, and it exists." So what I want to say, my point is that I am personally in favor of having dispensaries and having a tax and having revenue from it, only if we keep the right to grow it in our own backyard at the same time.
Yeah, I would not only like to see that, I actually think, and they're part of the discussion, and I think Dan touched on it, is that there's different views on how to do it. I think most everybody thinks that we should have smaller scale and not massive corporate cannabis companies. But that's easier said than done. And then there is the debate now is more about sort of what level of regulation. Because for those who are still in the propagandic world, think there needs to be really high levels of regulation, and that ultimately makes it much harder for small producers to meet all that because of the costs. I happen to think we should have a two-tier system, a wholesale tax and a retail tax, and I'll explain why in a minute. When you sell a product to a store that's then going to sell it to a consumer, or you sell it to a wholesaler that sells it to a store or to a consumer, you no longer have that direct connection that we at the community level always have had, and it's part of what makes Vermont so special. And so there's a level of regulation and cost to that would argue there should be two levels: a wholesale tax and then to the top. I happen to think we should also allow for there to be a co-op model, where as a smaller producer, 50 plants, whatever it might be, 200 members, that you can actually have a much lower level of regulation, and you would only have the retail tax because you're selling it direct to the consumer. So Vermonters would actually pay a lower amount than tourists who are going to the ski areas in downtown Burlington and everything else from out of state. And you would be sort of, I think, honoring that Vermont, I can look you, the producer, in the face, ask you what you're spraying on it or not, how you're producing your product, and trust you or not, and be a member of your co-op or not. We have that in Vermont because of the community scale. But once you get 2 or 3 people away from where it's produced, just like any other good that we buy, you start to you have to have a regulatory framework that says X can be used or Y can't be used in this production.
We already have a framework for certified organic CBD.
Correct.
So why can that not be extended to THC? I mean, these people are already set up.
Right, but that's for an organic standard. It doesn't necessarily, all cannabis is not going to be organic.
Right. Well, medicinal, for example, then, like we already have all of the testing and everything in
Right.
place, all the standards to have your product in a medicinal dispensary, and
Right.
could those not be applied to recreational?
Many could. I'm not saying we shouldn't have any regulation, but what I'm saying is the level of regulation and the level of taxation, I think, can be different based on those two models that can fit.
I'm sorry. Well,
No, that's fine. I
I
think
don't
that
think that wholesale taxation is going to be passed right along the consumer.
some of it will be, yeah.
I should-
But that's why, but as a consumer, you can find a local purveyor and you would pay less. And I'm not saying these should be high rates, but it should be split in, it should be bifurcated, whatever our overall goal of taxation is, so that Vermonters are paying that lesser amount if you have a direct co-op connection, which throughout Vermont, if you've already been a consumer in this non-existent underground market that hasn't existed for the last 50 years, it's codifying that market so that it can continue and those producers don't get squeezed out and those relationships don't get destroyed in a full-on sort of regulated marketplace like everything else.
What worries me about that though is that, I mean, the taxing and it being passed on to the consumer, you may set up a situation where black market prices are lower than the
Right.
regulated environment.
But that's about what the rate of taxation
Right.
is.
But the other thing is if you, with some of the regulations, and I do think some regulations are necessary, but a lot of them come with the permitting fee. And the permitting fees that I've seen in the bill as it's been written are way too high for most small scale Vermont growers to get in.
That's right.
And so you're gonna see some large scale farms that are able to do it, you're gonna see the people who are already established in the medicinal market do it, and then you're gonna see Philip Morris and, you know.
We're all on the same page.
That's probably why the bill didn't come out to me.
Well,
Yeah, no, those rates were much too high, and you know, folks,
Because that's where it got
there was a
stuck.
discussion that the income was going to be this cash cow for Vermont,
No, it's not.
and people kept painting that that's why I was doing it without ever asking me why I was doing it, which is very frustrating. It would have been a much bigger cash cow had we done it 5 years ago than doing it now. It will still be a revenue generator, not through the direct sale of cannabis, but if we continue to build on our good reputation as a product manufacturer across the board in Vermont, just like we do with craft beer, we advertise craft beer, people come to this state to go canoeing and hiking and sailing and whatevering, and go have a nice beer at the end of the day. Well, they can do the same. So I think there will be other growth in what is our strength, which is the tourism economy. But it's not going to be this massive cash cow, nor should the tax rate be high. I think the combined tax rate should be more than 10 or 15%. Now remember, what you get from a regulated market is you know what you're getting. You know, you go in a store, you got X% THC, sativa, indica, this kind, that kind, higher, lower, and you can even know where it was sourced or how it was grown. Right now in the underground market, unless you have that direct relationship with a local producer, you're getting catch as what catch can. And that's what the benefit of paying potentially a little bit more. The other thing is, once it's legal and the prices drop, as it's been shown to do in most states, the incentive to be an underground seller, and I try not to use the term black market, if you pause for a minute, and even the term marijuana, I tend not to use. Cannabis, an underground or illicit market, tends to pull back from that propagandic language that was so racist. But as the prices go down, the incentive to work in the underground market for the risk of the getting caught is no longer as good a risk-reward scenario as it is when the prices are high, because there is no regulated
The
market.
prices already have come down.
Well, that's right. Well, we got swamped by all the homegrown. And so the idea of there being an illicit market starts to shrink just because of supply and demand. And that, in turn, the other big reason people use against it is kids are going to get it. And I remind folks that kids can get it today faster than you can imagine
Yes.
to blink. And in fact, if the underground market becomes less profitable and there are fewer people in that market, in fact, it will get harder. It will never be impossible. There's going to be an underground market. Young people are going to get it. Look at alcohol, look at everything else. But it'll actually be harder, not easier, with a full tax and regulated
So
system.
have more money for education programs within schools and also recovery programs for people that want help. So.
But why it hasn't happened yet? Call your own reps and senators and ask them to ask the committee members and leadership why, and that'll start to move the ball. Please.
All right, topic change, sorry
Okay,
guys.
that's fine. We've been on that.
So I live in Johnson, and there's been a very recent media blitz on the Opportunity Zone program that's come down from the Trump administration, and Governor Phil Scott has designated, I think, 25 opportunity zones. And a lot of us in town just found out that Johnson is an opportunity zone. And I recall last November, there was a community forum meeting. It was at 8 a.m. on a Friday morning. I wasn't able to attend, and I don't know how many other people attended, so we never really got the information. So a lot of us were shocked to find out about this. We have no zoning in our town. I mean, we have form-based code. Thank you, Kim, and Charles, and others. But we have no zoning, and I've done a little research on the program, and it seems very dubious to me, and so what do you have to say about it? What do you know?
I know almost nothing, so I will have to get back to you on that. So afterwards, let's make sure to trade info, and also that's a good opportunity for me to
And
pass these cards.
we had some correspondence.
Ed and I had a little e-conversation.
Yes.
Yeah.
David, the person we get in touch with about that is Keisha.
Yeah, so Keisha's the one that
She gave
gave the presentation.
Yeah.
You know, and if you really look into it, it's a pretty, they're still trying to figure out exactly how it's gonna be implemented. You know, the podcast that I sent over to you basically shows that it might be something that is never going to benefit or have any impact on Vermont because the investment levels are so high and the return rates are so, you know, someone has to put that money away for 10 years. It has to be out of capital gains investment that they can have tax-free if they leave it invested for 10 years. It's in.
And the deadlines might not be done.
I don't.
Not all of them, it's a weird kind of.
Yeah, but I don't think we're gonna see it in. I don't think we're gonna see it here in Vermont. Like it was really set up for New York and New Jersey and places where, you know, corporate headquarters are going to be built, where these big multinational corporations can dump and hide their capital gains for 10 years,
Right.
and be even bigger billionaires. So, you know, though it would be great to see some good investment here in our communities, you know, that would be great, but
I will
I
say,
wouldn't hold my breath.
I've heard from a couple of different people that there is a big push to direct some investors to certain projects around the state, and Johnson is on the list of, you know, big projects that they're looking at.
What kind of project?
That's the question. Yeah.
That's the question.
Yeah, I'm on the DRB, the Development Review Board, and so we've had some conversations about this, and kind of my whole job is pointless unless there is someone who wants to develop here. Same thing with this opportunity zone thing. And even if they do want to develop here, like Dan was saying, they have to do it in a very specific way. They have to take money out of capital gains, and then and so the chances of it even doing anything here are pretty slim. It could be used very hopefully, but it's tough to do so.
And there is a portion of it that can be invested, like if you had an investment here in Johnson and then a portion of the money where they could get a bigger return could be in Stowe or another neighboring.
Yes.
But they haven't really figured out how that's gonna work. And so they're waiting for information to come out of the feds on this, and
Might be
know,
waiting a while.
we might have a different administration in there by the time they figure it out, and it might not be a program anymore, so who
You know,
knows?
from what I can tell, it's, you know, my concern right off the bat was that there's no, there's a few things. Number one, there's no requirement for whoever wants to invest to have some plan to improve the community in any meaningful capacity. Number two, there's no requirement for the investors to create any jobs. Number three, there's no mechanism for any reporting. There's no data collection. So communities would never know whether the money invested in the community, whether that outcome matches the tax rate, which is an incredible
And at the
tax
state
rate.
level, we're not gonna have a lot of control over that. That's a Fed program, and
Yeah, the Fed.
I have no idea, you know, it's not something that I think we're gonna see, even though.
All right.
Jackie, sorry, I just wanted to add to that information that I just got, I'm on the select board here in Johnson, from the LCPC is that they just got news that for properties that are considered disaster zones, like environmentally disaster zones, like some of our brownfields properties, the EDA is offering to pay for 80%. If you are an opportunity zone, the EDA is offering to pay 80% for the cleanup of those spaces so that they can be redeveloped.
Okay,
So that's where we may.
there's
see
one
this.
benefit from the
Well, cautiously.
This might be what we're on now.
Some of that.
So that's where we may see it coming
Yeah.
And I mean, an 80% on a $2 million,
Yeah.
still means you got to come up with 400,000. So it's not as given, but that's nice to hear. And you had your hand up, was that for that reason, or was this, okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, hi, I'm Barry Cronin. I live in Johnson and I work with Dennis Thomas. Recently, I learned that Senator Leahy got $6 million approved to help fight the opiate crisis. That money was then, I think, put in a placeholder fund at EVM, but nobody seems to know anything more than that. And I would like somebody to oversee how that money is being dispersed and to see if some of that money can be put to good use to the people that really need the money, not to research or things like of that nature, but to the people that
Right down
really
on the
need
street,
the help.
yeah.
And that money is just sitting there. Now, I understand Leahy somehow magically got the money. Now, I don't care how he got the money, all right? But I do care how it's spent, and it is already here.
And have you spoken to his staff at all about it?
I have not.
So I ran into Senator Leahy at the car show down in Waterbury and spoke to him extensively about this and Jenna's promise and a bunch of other issues.
Yeah, all this stuff. you're doing.
So I actually, had some talk about this with him, and we'll circle back to find out. But last week I had coffee with Dr. Lamanta from the UVM Center on Aging, and I had a good conversation with him that this money is sitting at UVM, and because he's a department chair of the Center on Aging, maybe he could look into how we help older Vermonters with recovery around opiates, because we changed how prescribers can prescribe, and there's a lot of people that are being told they can't have the level of prescriptions that they've had in the past. And so we're going to need that money out in rural communities, and it's supposed to be for rural communities.
I just hate to see it get wasted, right?
We're trying to figure out where it is. It's really new, and as Senator Leahy told me, he said that who's ever Senate chair of appropriations, some guy from like Alabama or somewhere, said, he said it in this southern voice, he goes, Senator, if you think Vermont should have $6 million for opiate recovery, you put $6 million right in the budget and write it's for Vermont. So he said, so I did that.
And he got it.
And he got it. So I'm also going to a Medicaid seminar in DC in the first part of October, and I'm trying to set up some time to talk to him more about how we can get that money out of UVM into the communities where we need it for recovery. And I have no idea, but if I ask enough questions, maybe something will happen.
Yeah, that's great.
Barring any more Senate magic, what are your ideas for bringing investment into our state?
Well, it's interesting if there was a magic bullet we have found. My biggest effort would be actually, I talked about quite a while ago, which is to do this 5-year infrastructure investment, whether it's weatherization, rural broadband. I think if we had high-speed internet into a lot of our rural areas, you'd have the opportunities for people to set their businesses in these communities. I think it's really important to recognize that rural parts of this country, it doesn't matter how blue or red, sometimes politicians start getting very rhetorical about these policies are making young people leave, or these jobs leave, or this or that. The reality is there's a demographic shift, it doesn't matter red or blue policies, away from rural areas into urban and suburban areas. And where Vermont kind of really falls off the map is, as urban as Burlington is, and there's the whole divide of Burlington, Chittenden County, and the rest of the state, Burlington is still the 250th largest community in the country. I mean, it's not an urban area. And, it's obviously holding its own, relatively speaking, to the rest of the state. It's also a community that put a ton of money into high-speed internet. Yeah, got a lot of bad press for how that ultimately went down, but dealer.com and all these businesses are there because of it. And so, to me, putting a pretty significant investment into rural broadband is a big one. I would actually like to see us, this isn't necessarily bringing out-of-state money in, but I'd like to see us do something for the dairy industry that isn't just continued grants to get people through the low spots. I'd actually like to see us take a chunk of money, invest in really establishing a Vermont brand of milk at a bottling plant in southern Vermont to distribute to the southern New England area, because to them, Vermont is their backyard. You know, we have these state boundaries up here of these little teeny states, and in most other parts of the country, we don't fit within one state. And so sometimes we think, oh, Boston and Connecticut, those other places. Well, those are the consumers of our milk. And if we could actually put some money into branding Vermont milk, we have actually a higher quality milk than most of the milk in the country as far as somatic cell count. We don't have as many animals on pasture anymore, but we actually have more out there, and we could have that potentially some of the trade-off of just getting more money for your milk to the farmers is also some practices that you would have to potentially meet.
Wasn't that tried like 20 or 30 years ago? I remember.
Right. So there's two attempts that were made.
Yeah.
One was the St. Albans Co-op,
Okay.
and then also Anthony Felina started one that was right up in this
That's what
area.
I'm thinking of.
And I love Anthony Felina, and his ideas are great. That was a business, that was not an idea. And the business also worked well for the first year and a half when prices were low. And then milk actually went to one of the highest it's been, which is about $22 a hundredweight. And that actually tanked the business because of how the model was set up.
So you're talking about today, you can learn from those mistakes.
We can absolutely learn from those.
That is
And
such a good.
the other part of it is someone earlier today was mentioning that the VPR series investigating how our state dollars working. One of them was about farm to table. And I will tell you, as someone who started a farm business 20 years ago, the demand for my product has grown. The interest in buying local quality from your farmer, whether organic, I happen to be organic, but there's plenty of conventional farms that are growing more food and people are buying locally. That concept exists in Massachusetts and Connecticut. People want to buy more regional food. And so having a Vermont brand of milk at this moment in time in the region is a very different thing than 15 and 20 years ago. And so partly good ideas can be at the wrong time and good ideas can be at the right time.
I always wondered
So-
why it failed.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk offline quite a bit about that. But so I think building on our rural economy is the best way to go. And it isn't through one big draw. I think it's through lots of small, which is what the rural telecom.
Well, where do we stand on it? I mean, half my money is made through IT.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people, if you talk to computer repair guys around here, they'll tell you, we drive down this road, we get to this driveway, we go half a mile, we walk in, and there's a bank, a room full of computers, and these people are just making their money there. And that is a way to bring people into the city. So how are you progressing on that, or what would be the steps to do that?
We invested quite a bit in rural broadband in this last legislative session, and I know towns like Johnson and Hyde Park have put together broadband committees to try to really, or fiber committees. This broadband is not really the right word. So, you know, I think over time, I think you'll start to see towns pick up and run with this, and I hope that, you know, Woolcake gets involved with it as well. But I know Johnson and Hyde Park are.
But I think there's a couple other pieces to this as well. As a state, we need to be talking about what an amazing place it is to raise a family and settle in. And we, at times, have sort of this naysayer attitude about all the problems that we have. And you don't want to shirk your problems. You want to talk very clearly about them. But as the commander-in-chief, governor, the salesperson-in-chief, going around and talking to people about how amazing our schools are, which actually, if you compare our public schools with public schools in other rural parts of the country, they're really quite remarkable. Now, are we getting all the results we want? No. Do they cost more? Yes. And you get what you pay for. If you want cheap schools, bad schools, go to Alabama. That's what you get when you keep talking about cutting your schools and cutting your schools and cutting your schools. So part of it is actually just what is the message about the state? And if the message about the state is property tax is really high and we're not getting anything for them from our schools, that's actually inaccurate on the second half. It is accurate that they're high, but we also have income adjustment for those who are in the working class, and that is almost never talked about by the rhetoric of top of our schools.
And it's true that the fact is that our population of school children
It's
is
dropped.
like 120 out of 80.
So,
Oh, it's
Look at
huge.
this room, I mean, we don't have a lot of greeters here, unfortunately.
a small thing that I'm working on.
Get active.
Sorry. I
A small thing I'm working on to try to attract more people, younger people to Vermont.
They're called leaders.
I'll keep going.
We can have fun.
So I don't know, anyone here serve AmeriCorps? Anyone serve AmeriCorps programs? Got AmeriCorps right here, all right? Anybody else? So, I have proposed some legislation to match the education award for AmeriCorps members to attract more AmeriCorps people to Vermont, because if you come here for 2 years, you serve for 2 years, you go to school for 2 years, maybe you'll stay here. Did you move here through an AmeriCorps program?
No, I did the Honor Leader program
Okay.
at Johnson State.
Yeah. Yeah,
And it was just an internship.
Sure.
And I worked very closely with the conservation district. It was
Yep.
Great group.
So it's a good way to bring people into the community, into our state from out of state, and hopefully they'll stay here. And so I tried to attach it onto a bill around emissions check engine lights, because I wanted to start an AmeriCorps program to fix people's emission systems so that their cars wouldn't pollute. And I was like, well, then we can just match the AmeriCorps award. And so I tried to do that, and it didn't work. But it's okay, here we come again. Wait for next session. I'm not done with this thing yet, so.
And also, it's important, there's two ways to build our communities. One is to bring people in. The other is also to try to hold on to folks that are here.
Mm-hmm.
And, we have really pretty good tech schools. But when I went and visited tech schools recently, a lot of the kids and some of the faculty talked about how it still has this stigma about it to go to a tech school instead of going through the rest of the high school nearby. And it's an awful and ridiculous stigma, because I've been trying to get a refrigerator repair person for one of the fans in my cooler for 3 weeks now. And typically these folks bill out at 60, 75, 80 bucks an hour. And so electricians, plumbers, these jobs are actually really wanting in Vermont right now, just like a lot of others, but they're actually decent pay. Most of my farm colleagues are struggling to find farm workers, but that's ridiculous work at ridiculous pay. These jobs are good jobs. So we also have to change the stigma about that.
And I think our tech centers are starved for students, because if Lamoille South sends 10 kids to Lamoille North to go to the tech center, the money follows the students. And so all of a sudden, now their budget is that much short. So, I would say that probably in Vermont we need 16 supervisory unions, actually 17. One for children who are in state custody. The rest of them draw the supervisory unions around our tech centers, so that the money stays in the supervisory union and the kids all are moving in and out of that system. Because if you go up to the tech center, they could use more kids coming in there, and they can only operate with how many kids go there. So
Wait, is there any outreach on that?
I don't know, I proposed it to the education committee, and they were like, thanks, Dan.
I'm fairly sure that's how Act 46 started its infancy in the legislature, was as a supervisory union consolidation, and then
Supervisory union consolidation.
through the
District
political process,
consolidation.
it changed it on to school districts, and then they consolidated school boards into the supervisory unions, which didn't make sense to me at the time, because a lot more money goes into the supervisory unions than into the school boards, like $100 a year or whatever.
And we're 4 miles apart with the 2 supervisory unions in Lamoille County. So, I think we should try to get more kids. Is Lamoille South sending the kids to Lamoille North at the rate that they need? Or are they making the best decision? So, anyways.
Well, and there may be other ways to resolve it as well. My guess is, just hearing people around the state right now, the concept of consolidating administrative situations in schools is probably off the table for a little while. But there may well be, which is probably why you got the reception you got, because Act 46 has created its own little turbulence in the water. But that doesn't mean we can't, as a state, try to figure out how to adjust that money follows a student with respect to our tech schools.
Yeah.
And maybe there's a way to have it be a partial divide, or the state as a whole pays a different part of that into the tech schools, so that less money has to leave the sending town. And that could help alleviate not just the stigma, but then the financial disincentive you're talking about. Did you have any other?
I've been wanting to.
Okay.
If we can change to a completely new topic.
We talk about all kinds of things at this coffee.
I'm Diana Osborne, and I live here in Johnson. I work full-time as a paramedic in Morristown. And my primary concern is with the, the death of the EMS system in our state. And I just don't even know if people know how bad it truly is. That right now, the expectation is there that you pick up your phone and you call 911, and that somebody will come. And that system died 20 years ago. And it's in such desperate condition right now, and I'm not hearing much at the state level in terms of addressing it. Within the Department of Health, the state EMS training coordinator position has now been vacant for a year. And I think everybody knows the only way that this problem is going to get fixed is by getting more providers. And that's not going to happen unless we get that position filled. Dan Batesy, the chief of EMS, is a good friend of mine, and he identifies the problem, but I don't think he's getting much help or support in actually solving it. We have a state EMS committee that meets all of maybe 2 times a year, and on their agenda for next year sometime is the concept of should municipalities be required to provide EMS service to their towns. And I think it will come as a huge surprise to most of you right here to find out that Johnson does not have to provide EMS. It's not something like fire and police that you're required to have. And so what's happening across the state is towns are deciding we just can't afford to get into that business, and we're just not going to do that anymore. And so small rural ambulance services are going under. Regionalized for-profit ambulance services are trying to come in and cover where they can. But in Morrisville, on that ambulance, we have 36 members right now. 3 of them live in Morrisville. The rest of the coverage is provided by people outside that town going in there. And so now I can't work on NEMS, which is in my town. And the services work together as cooperatively as they can to provide coverage. But I've come from Morrisville to Johnson to take care of a critical patient when NEMS was out of the area, which is the service that's here. And I don't think people who live here know that when you call 911, even if there's an ambulance right up here by the fairground, you might have to wait 30 minutes for me to come from Morrisville.
And why? Oh, because they're servicing somebody else.
Or because there's just not enough people and ambulances to go around. And the volunteer model of people supporting their own community through volunteering hours, that just isn't happening. It's not existent.
This is one of the sort of canary in the coal mines of this issue of our hollowing out of the communities, right? We have more and more people commuting, from Loyal County over to Chittenden County to work. That's happening all the way around Chittenden County. Well, if you work 45 minutes or an hour away, it's hard to be a volunteer on your fire, EMS, etc. And I know it sounds like a broken record about repopulating our rural areas, but that's without people. That's what's going to happen. We're aging on the top end, so people are volunteering for lots of things. And volunteering on an EMS squad is not as easy at 70 as it is at 45. But then also, we don't have young people coming up in the ranks. So I think this is one of the canaries about that whole other problem that's happening. And I don't know what the answer is either.
And you said it's the Department of Health that hasn't filled the position?
Yes.
Oh, I'll give him a call. I don't know enough about it to talk about it, but I'd be glad to look into it and try to figure out, what the state's doing. And I'm on the Human Services Committee, so we're kind of, I guess you could consider us the board of directors for the Department of Health, Department of Children and Families, and Department of Aging and Independent Living. But so I have some good contacts there. They're legislative liaison I talk to on different issues around addiction and recovery, and I'm sure they would be able to answer questions around why that position hadn't been filled.
And did you get my cards when they came around here yet?
I'm sorry?
Did you get my cards when they came around here yet?
I did, but I think I can make contact with you online.
Yeah. You definitely can, but Martha's going to bring you a card.
Yeah, same. I'd be glad to look and find out what's going on there. I don't know a lot about it, so.
I don't think the problem is with the State Department of Health people.
Okay.
It's not that they don't realize that there's a problem or that they haven't tried to take efforts to solve it. You know, they're advertising for that position nationally in GEMS and EMS1.com. So it's not that they don't
Okay.
know,
Okay, good to know.
but there is,
I thought it wasn't being filled because they just aren't.
no,
Okay.
there's nobody to do it.
Okay, yeah.
And I mean, I could quit my job in Morrisville tomorrow, and I can tell you off the top of my head, 8 services where I could get a full-time job. You know, there's just not enough people to go around. And that's,
Is it because of the rate of pay? Because I know EMT is not a high-paying job.
paramedics get paid very little.
So is that one of the problems? Would you say in attracting people?
But I think more important than that is that we've been relying on a volunteer model where the pay is nothing.
Right.
And if people are willing to give away a skill for nothing,
Right.
then if I try to do it as a career, it's hard for me to get more than, you know, $15 an hour.
Is there a Medicaid reimbursement to ambulances?
Yes.
Like, so you're being reimbursed at 50 cents on the dot or whatever?
Yeah, we're the only revenue generating department of the town because the cost for our services is often covered by insurance companies or
Yep.
Medicaid reimbursement.
Yeah.
So, thank you, and we will try not to do more, but it sounds like you already know the answer, at least they're trying to find it, they can't even find it, to fill that position, which sounds like a pretty key thing to do. This one with her lovely child is also been having her hand up to ask a question.
Thank you.
Tell us.
Yeah, my lovely child's covering me with delicious brownie. So taking out to your comment, your committee is the oversight board for Department of Health, DCF, and AL. I am concerned about DCF right now and the lack of oversight. There was a recent federal court order against CCF to make some changes at Woodside and basically stop mistreating kids by overuse of physical restraint, improper physical restraint, excessive use of seclusion, and some other inhumane practices. And there's also a recent lawsuit alleging that DCF in Caledonia County had taken a mother's 3 children from her without any court process, and that the process for challenging a decision by DCF to substantiate a person for abusing a child, which results in placing a name on a registry, possibly indefinitely, and can impact a lot of things like employment, is just not adequate. And so it strikes me that it's an agency that is not transparent at all. Confidentiality is intended to protect the people who are involved with DCF, the parents and children, but it has instead been served as a shield for the agency in a way that's harmful. And it's very big, it has a lot of power, and it doesn't really have any oversight or accountability. The lack of transparency and the difficulty that the press have in getting information about what goes on in DCF means that the only time you ever hear about anything is when there's a lawsuit. I know a lot, but I can't talk about it. So it seems like we have your committee, we have the Joint Child Protection Oversight Committee, and it's not enough. And so I'm just wondering if, I know you have the bill, I'm hoping it can get off the wall. I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind talking about it.
Sure. So
how it might.
I worked with Ann Hughes, the chair of the Human Services Committee, to put in a bill to create the Office of the Child Advocate. So it's like an ombudsman program for children who are in DCF custody outside of DCF, outside of state government, as a way to look at how children are treated, and I can use your hands, by the way.
No, that's right.
Well, and Senator Ballant has been interested in this as well, along with Representative Pugh, and I'm hoping that we could see some movement on this, and maybe it could be at legal aid, be housed there, like we do with the long-term care ombudsman program for people who are in nursing homes. Just a way that we can have some accountability around some of the stories we hear come out of DCF that, and then also, really our overall goal is to have children who are in the foster care system transition to adulthood and to, be able to be productive members of our society. And, if we can help them through that process, when things don't go as well. It also, as foster families have issues, it might be a good way outside of DCF to have some intervention so that we don't lose foster families when things don't go the way they should. Because those are really hard to find, those people.
I just want to add that Meg Pulley, who is my chief of staff, who's mainly are on this fine little target, probably DCF is the biggest reason people reach out to my office. And literally just last week, we sat down with Ken Schatz and a couple other people and said, what are the procedures around some of these things? What is going on? Why are there so many issues and challenges? And I'm not going to say they answered completely unsatisfactorily, but it wasn't great answers. And a lot of it was, well, we can't talk about this, we can't talk about that. And I go a long way back with Ken. He's a very decent person, and he's trying to do the best he can in what's actually a pretty difficult circumstance most of the time. But in terms of doing something, I think policy changes are part of it, and part of it is, I don't know the last time he was called into the Lieutenant Governor's office and said, so what's really going on, and can we get some follow-up on this, and who's going to give us this information? And so we're digging a little bit, and sometimes it's about, it's not a full light for all of you to see, but when they go, wow, people are starting to look at us again, we better figure it out, they better figure it out.
And I had a good conversation with Aldo Bay before he left about how we can get the department involved in creating this position so that it's not used as a tool of aid. It's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking to just help the children that are in their custody, make sure they're treated humanely, and that they have the best outcome that we can provide for them.
So what about this whole transparency issue? And I agree with you, there are other agencies that totally shroud and cloud themselves under this almighty confidentiality, and there's no oversight, there's no transparency, there's no leverage for an average citizen to get at them.
So there's two things there. One is, it is a delicate balance, because individuals' privacy that the state deals with.
Yeah, but in your office, when you have a conversation, why can you not, within the four walls of your office, why cannot your colleague give you an answer? Why does he even stonewall against you when you ask him?
Well, ultimately, and it's sort of like HIPAA in the medical world, like you can be the spouse of a doctor. That doctor is not going to tell you about something with their patient. So as Lieutenant Governor, I'm still a citizen that is your private information for Shane not to tell me if he's the person that's overseeing what's going on with you. On the other hand, there are boards, and those boards have some access to that, more so than I do as Lieutenant Governor. But I would also say that that's actually the job. We do such a bad job of sort of civics education in this country, and the jobs of your rep, your senator, your Lieutenant Governor is to aggregate these questions and ask and push this dial along. Dan, earlier I was joking saying, do you have a job? Because you do so much work. It sounds like you have so many issues. I know you do. I know, but you're doing that. But you've impressed me with a number of things that he's been investigating and things that he's been going to. But it's supposed to work that way. And legislators get so few calls from their constituents, certainly during policy making. I think more so to help get through government than for making policy, or for changing policy to say there needs to be more accountability. or this position needs to be put in. And when you call your legislator and ask for that, your legislator goes to that committee or serves on that committee and goes to their chair and says, I'm getting a lot of calls about this. You know, amongst the issues we gotta address, is anybody else hearing about this? And they start to talk about it with their colleagues. So when you make those calls, that's what generates the meme and the zeitgeist and the discussion around the building. Otherwise, it's what the media creates or what some interest group creates. And so, or leadership, which is often related to some of those other things in terms of how they create their ideas. And so, my asking some of these questions, and Dan being able to say to his chair, a number of my constituents brought up these issues around DCF. Are we going to be revisiting that? And eventually, you start having committee hearings about it. That starts to get the folks who have been not transparent to figure out what they need to change in order to not have these phone calls happen. So, I mean, Vermont's so small, that's what's so amazing about it.
Well, it is, and I agree, and I have been sitting during so many board meetings. My particular issue is wildlife protection, and it is in such a sorry state in Vermont. Right now, we are waiting for a decision on the House Bill 411 on wanton waste and killing, and it's not going anywhere because we are running against stonewalling and lobbyists. And it is kind of infuriating because there's so many hundreds and literally thousands of Vermonters have contacted the State House up to the governor. We get platitudes and it gets blocked off as sentimental and as, well, basically as personal and sentimental when it has been proven in many cases as scientifically proven, without a doubt, and we are still being not heard.
Yep. So a couple things. I know Cal's going to say a wrap-up comment.
Well,
We're getting close to being done.
we told them 7 o'clock.
So we should wrap up after this.
Wrap up just as soon as possible here.
Okay. So a couple things. As someone who represents now the breadth of the state and have constituents all across the state who reach out to me, I've had folks reach out to me on this topic. I think it's also important to recognize there are thousands of people for whom that way of life and that is a piece of their culture in the community as well. Hold on. Well, wait a minute though. I just want to say that when you say it's just because lobbyists, that's not, that the bill isn't moving. I think that's not entirely accurate. There are a lot of folks in various parts of the state who reach out to their reps and senators as well and say, this hunting, this XYZ is a part of what we do as well. And our culture is already hollowing out, our state is hollowing out, our way of life is disappearing. Don't take another thing away from us. So there are always on many of these issues, we often know the people that agree with us, right? Far more people who support cannabis reform talk to me about it. And far more people who oppose to it talk to a different legislator about that. So we sometimes don't really see the other camps of people and how big or small they are. I'm not trying to say one side is right or wrong, but it isn't just a lobbyist thing that's stopping that bill. I think there's actually a pretty divided community out there about that topic.
And we don't get adequate representation. That's what it is. So right now, the board of the Department of Fish and Wildlife is entirely 100% made up of hunters. And any attempt to get a non-consumptive person on the board is being actively blocked. And that can be proved. We have the proof that it has been reflected. And that is just not okay.
And part of that would be, if you want to change that, I think it's changing the purpose of the board. Because I think partly who's getting appointed to the board is related to what the definition of the board's job is.
That is the protection of wildlife. And making it as an accessible part of Vermont life for all citizens. It doesn't mean necessarily you can only be on the board if you want to kill someone. You can also be on the board, per definition, if you appreciate wildlife. A life, not just mounted on a wall.
Right.
So, but the very act that the applications for a board position of very qualified people have gone unanswered, unresponded to, just, basically put in the round bin, and someone else has been appointed who didn't even apply for the job. is extremely troubling to me.
And those are appointed by the governor, correct?
Yes, but why? Why didn't the other
He
seven
appoints all
applicants,
boards.
didn't even get a phone call back?
Yeah, many of the boards are appointed, there's committees that sometimes others of us have appointed
So-
potential, but,
So
so
this is
fair
just,
enough.
so
But
this is just one issue that points towards this non-transparency, that points towards this clubbiness. And
Was Representative Odie working on some discussion around that this summer? Representative Odie, Carol Odie, I think she was working on some discussion around the wanton waste bills this summer with a summer group to try to come to some agreement. I know that committee is really going to be focusing on some changes to Act 250 and really, so I have no idea what Fish, Wildlife, and Natural Resource Committee is going to take up this session, but I know that Carol was having some discussion with both sides, and I don't know where it went. She came in as a sophomore, and that's how I know it.
so I would
So-
like to see that back, because I don't think that wanton killing is part of Vermont culture. I don't think wastefulness is part of Vermont culture.
okay.
Thanks.
We are gonna wrap
Yeah.
up. As it is, we did advertise this till 7 at 7:23. If folks do want to reach out to me, please feel free. Meg does the best she can. Dan, you know how to find him as well. If you didn't get a chance to sign up for the newsletter, you still have an opportunity to. And thank you so much for being here all the way to the end. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Go
much.
after it.